Bonjour, pour l'instant, je n'ai pas le son. Hein. Je vois quelqu'un, mais je n'ai pas le son.
No sound.
Allô, allô, allô. Allô. Est-ce que quelqu'un m'entend?
Oui, on vous entend, monsieur. On est en train de travailler avec les techniciens.
OK.
Merci.
Opening remarks.
Thank you. Hello. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at the launch event of the Economic Report on Africa 2021 here in Dakar, Senegal, during our 54th session of the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning, and Economic Development. This report has the theme of addressing the challenges of poverty, vulnerability in the time of COVID-19. And it's really of particular relevance given what we have seen during the pandemic and the implication for the continent one of the perhaps the most critical implications of COVID-19 has been the reversal of very hard-won gains that the continent has managed to achieve in terms of reducing poverty. So we've lost almost 2 decades of hard-won gains of reducing poverty in Africa due to the pandemic. And this report really tries to analyze the implication of COVID-19 in terms of poverty, but also looking at new dimensions of those that are highly vulnerable, not only those that are just around or fall below the poverty line, but those that are close to that line and can move in and out of poverty due to exogenous shocks. So it brings, the element of people-centric analysis to what has been happening during COVID and what do we need to do to actually ensure that these vulnerable population are actually protected in terms of social safety nets and policies that can help us get there. The situation as we're seeing now, the situation is even getting more compounded with the implication of the war in Ukraine and how this is really hitting the most vulnerable with the particularly with the food crisis and the implication for food insecurity. So what we're discussing today is even becoming far more critical than when the report was prepared. So I look very much forward to hearing the discussion, the analysis, and then for us to really go back and think, what can we do more so that we are making sure that we are putting people first, that we're having no one left behind because of the series of exogenous shocks that the continent has faced over the last 2 to 3 years. So very warm welcome to you and look forward to hearing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Executive Secretary. Can we give her a round of applause, please? That's not loud enough. Can we do that again, please? I'll now give the floor to Adrian Ushi, who is in the Gender, Poverty and Social Development, Social Policy Division, to take us through this report. Adrian, you have the floor.
Thank you. So, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here on a Saturday morning. So the ERA is on poverty and vulnerability during the time of COVID-19. First key message that we would like to portray is that the pandemic resulted in an economic contraction of 2.2%. So this pushed an estimated 55 million people into extreme poverty. So what we are talking about here is the additional part of poverty. So people who were above, as the Deputy Executive Secretary rightly pointed out, this is those people who were above the poverty line who fell into poverty. And this reversed, again, like the Deputy Secretary General was saying, 2 decades of progressive poverty reduction. The adverse household level impact, so this study is on the micro level data, the impact of COVID-19 through a combination of supply and demand shocks that led to a decline in economic activity, job losses, and decline in income or income losses, and the limited ability to manage risks. So previously, when there was a drought, households used to smooth consumption so that they would, like, for example, selling off assets so that they could deal with this shock. But because the shock was based on uncertainty of the future and the need to calculate the risk. This was not possible anymore. This is the first time that this has happened. This is an extremely important message. So, as you can see, these are the absolute number of poor in Africa since 1990. So, as you can see, the figures of additional poor go particularly from 2002 onwards, when the economic growth started at 5%, were very, very significant in terms of the reduction in poverty. In 2014, you realize that there is a sharp increase, and this is possibly due to the fact that the commodity boom had stopped in 2014. Indeed, Africa's economic growth dropped to about 3.5% from 5% previously. Then in 2020, we come to our figure of 55 million new poor because of COVID. Now, one interesting fact is, if you apply the mathematical model of growth and its coefficient to the number of poor, and you calculate the number of vulnerable who fell into poverty, you come up with the same figure. So this shows that our analytical rigor was on the spot. Excuse me? Okay. Sorry. So, one thing we realized when we were doing this study is that we realized that poverty is dynamic. So everybody thinks that poverty is some big amorphous whole of people living below $1.90 a day. But in Africa, it is highly dynamic, and households move in and out of poverty. Just to give a couple of numbers, 60% of Africa's poor is chronic, 40% is transient. 40% is a large percentage of total of people who move in and out of poverty. Just to give you another example, in the last large exogenous shock, the HIV pandemic in the 90s, in Uganda, the studies that we have found have shown that when households fell into poverty, they remained in poverty for 7 years. So the transient poor falling into poverty and the length of time it remains in poverty become an important part of how we address policy to solve this problem. So, we need to understand the nexus between poverty and vulnerability, as we were saying. In Africa, latest figures we've got is that 431 million people live under $1.90 a day. And what was not done, in our opinion, was the fact that income groups just above the poverty line were vulnerable to falling into poverty. So we thought that, given that COVID affected through lockdowns, through income losses, through job losses, etc., that the vulnerable people just above the poverty line were due to fall into poverty. So what we need, one of the things that has emerged, is we need to hedge against risks of these income losses. And there are two aspects where we could hedge against risks, in our opinion. One is in the social investments themselves, and the other is in poverty reduction strategy. So the poverty reduction strategies so far are generally for households below $1.90. We are saying, if we accept the 40% who are transient, then we have to hedge against risks of in poverty reduction strategies for the transient poor. So there is an effective limit in our fiscal space for doing so, but there is an opportunity to explore innovative and affordable market-led insurance schemes in collaboration with the private sector, but also in this idea of hedging against risks. So, as you can see, this is a graph, a histogram of a number of selected African countries with what is chronically poor, what is never poor, and what is downwardly or upwardly mobile. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation across countries, but what you can see as well is the fact that the middle part, so the yellow part, is quite substantial, and therefore moving in and out of poverty is shown in the figures here, and we need to consider that, particularly when we deal with shocks like COVID-19. So, yes. So, we are saying that economic vulnerability and consumption vulnerability force households into poverty. We've said this before, but what we wanted to say is that the concept of vulnerability, of fragility, of old age people, of young children, of has been limited. Thank you. Has been limited by this idea of economic vulnerability. So, what we have realized is that the non-poor, with consumption of 10% above the poverty line, so basically it would be about $2.05 a day, $2.10 a day, were the most vulnerable or precarious, not to use vulnerable all the time, precarious of falling into poverty. And we have done, the next slide you will see, but what we have done is to look at the vulnerable groups across the African subregions, just to show how they vary by subregion, and therefore how that variance by subregion allows us to be even more specific in our subregional policy formulation. So I think we could go to the next. So this is continued. So the vulnerable, sorry, one point which is important, the vulnerable people, so the people, again, 10% above the $1.90 a day. Most of them in Africa are in East and West Africa. 6.6% of total population are West Africa.
Recording in progress.
Are in East Africa. Please remember, we are talking about those above the poverty line, not necessarily the poor. So, nearly 60% of African countries, so 23 out of 36, are vulnerable on this count. What we did is, I think this is important to say, what we did is what determines vulnerability. So what we did is we looked at a number of labor market indicators, and the labor market indicators we did use to assess economic vulnerability we took three of particular importance: vulnerable employment, employment to population ratio, and skilled labor force. This allows us to assess the vulnerable. Given the demographics of Africa, or the population pyramid of Africa, the percentage of these people are generally young. So when we have been saying that we have to deal with young people and young people's employment, it is here that we find out that young people are one, highly represented in vulnerable employment and with little skills, and therefore vulnerable when an exogenous shocks hits. The second is that the Western, we said this before, the degree of difference, we said this before, sorry. So this is, again, to give us the figures. So the figures of North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. As you can see, there's a variation in the people or households who are vulnerable to falling into poverty. And as we were saying before, in West and Eastern Africa, they are the largest group of households that are vulnerable to fall into poverty. This makes it a particular attempt or a particular analysis of what we can do in those two sub-regions. Next. So the narrative that was out there about Africa is that Africa, when COVID hit, that Africa started increasing fiscal spending. It is incorrect. Africa had a mixture of monetary and fiscal policies. There were monetary policies such as interest rate drops. There were clear indication of loosening of guarantees by banks. So there were a number of policies showing that the African countries actually took on board that it was not only a health hazard, but was an economic hazard in totality. And therefore, this is quite interesting. Secondly, in Africa, Africa spends on average about 1.1% of GDP on social protection. During COVID, this increased to 3.3%. And it decreased to 3.3% through social assistance. One of the features of social protection in Africa is that it is not contributory. It is through general taxation. Now, because general taxation on average in Africa is only 17% roughly of GDP, there is a limit to which social assistance can be increased. Indeed, it did cause quite a drop in fiscal revenue in African countries. So, next, yes. The size of the response was constrained by fiscal space. But what occurred, please let us not forget, that when COVID hit, because of the macroeconomic situation in Africa, we were already facing a debt crisis and a fiscal deficit. So there was a exogenous shock on a system which was not particularly economically healthy. Notwithstanding this, I would say we increased from 1.1 to 2.3%, and we introduced more than 47 policies on interest rates, guarantees, loans to SMEs, etc. The report also finds that about 21 countries in Africa were in debt distress, and countries such as Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia were applying for debt relief under the G20 Common Framework, the SSI. So you have an exogenous shock hitting something which was slightly not amenable to another shock. And as the VES was saying, now that the shock has arrived and 55 million people have dropped into poverty, the Ukraine crisis is further added to this situation. So the estimates we have that it will take 6 years for Africa's fiscal deficit and debt to return to pre-COVID-19 levels. And these are the numbers. I thought this was important to realize. And as you can see, in 2020, which is when COVID was particularly strong on the African continent, both the fiscal deficit and the debt to GDP ratio was among the highest. And according to our estimates, it will take about 6 years to return to pre-COVID. So learning from others, this is a very important aspect. When we learn from others because prior to COVID, they had a particularly comprehensive social protection program. And when COVID hit, they were particularly efficient in identifying what should be done. So Egypt, Mauritania, and Seychelles were the three countries that we could learn from because they seem to have dealt with the vulnerable in a combination of sound policies ex ante, so before COVID, and measurements and the measures ex post to mitigate the impact of the crisis. On the other hand, countries such as Ethiopia and Nigeria have experienced high poverty and high vulnerability because they lacked more comprehensive social policy before and after the pandemic. Again, dear participants, what we realized in social policies and social protection in particular, in Africa, the social protection is across the life cycle. And in particular, the vulnerable are considered children and old age. The productive age group, so the 15 to 64, seem not to be covered by social protection. This is because they are working, this is because they are informally employed, but they remain the most vulnerable when a shock, when an exogenous shock hits. So we are saying that we need to relook at a social protection life cycle, not to leave anybody behind, but to concentrate on the productive age group, because that way you could have two positive effects. One, you could move towards a more contributory scheme of social protection. One. Two is that if you assist the productive age group, you have a drop in dependency ratio and you have a drop in income losses for example, children's schooling, health, etc., etc. So, some ideas for the future in breaking new ground. So, we have to understand, I've said this before, but we keep repeating it, there's a nexus between poverty and vulnerability to uninsured risks. We need to look at risks. There was COVID, Now there's Ukraine. In the future, there will be climate change, we are sure. And therefore, how do we ensure that households can deal with risk mitigation in this regard? Second, the prospects for rapid recovery for COVID-19 and resilience against future crises can be greatly enhanced through if governments in Africa increased spending from 1.1 to 2.2% through a number of measures. What we are seeing is that this was ad hoc. Maybe we need to think of those measures to become somewhat more structural in the social investment scheme and programs that governments have. So if that has worked, and it seems to have worked, therefore this should become a more permanent feature of our social investments. So again, we need to factor, we need to hedge against risks and factor these into social investments and poverty reduction strategies. One of the things that we realized of importance is the application of digital technologies. Now, the application of digital technology has a positive effect on two aspects. One, the identification of the vulnerable households, because we could pinpoint and target vulnerable households, but also it decreases the cost of transfers of cash transfers or transfers of safety nets to the households themselves. So a number of other points that we would like to raise is that, yes, COVID was a health hazard as well as a socio-economic hazard. So one of the things that we realized is that in Africa, households spend about 36% out of pocket, which means they pay for it by the household themselves, or private spending, which is the highest proportion of health expenditure, which means that if a family member becomes sick, the household could fall into poverty. And therefore, again, because we are thinking of, for example, health insurance schemes, this is the same principle as we are thinking of other social protection mechanisms. So we need to greater effort to mobilize resources, we've said this, to kickstart growth and build the resilience of households. We need to look at, again, I know we've said this before, but we think that given the crisis, some form of strategic arrangements, strategic discussion between the private and the public sector on hedging against risk becomes part of the future of the African policy response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adrian, for the presentation. I was about stopping you before you brought the presentation to a close. We've listened to Adrian, and I think we also need to take on board the perspective of the size of the stimulus packages that African countries put together. As documented by the report, it was a total of about $2.2 billion that African countries were able to spend in terms of stimulus packages. And if we compare that to the situation of Europe, for example, the Europe Recovery Plan was estimated at $2.1 trillion, $2.1 trillion, with several other financing mechanisms, including the European Stability Mechanism, which countries could buy into close to 240 billion euros. So we have a system on, of inequality here in terms of the ground that we are treading, being able to support the issue of poverty and vulnerability in the time of COVID-19. And I hope our discussants will take some of this on board in terms of the conversation we'll be having, access to resources, and what is the capacity of African countries to be able to support poverty reduction strategies, to be able to put together stimulus packages. What is the kind of access that they have to finance and resources to be able to ensure that few people slip into the poverty trap through the vulnerability matrix. I'll first of all call on Abebe Shmelis, who is the Director of Research at the African Economic Research Consortium. And is a friend, a part of ECA. He's interacted with ECA for a long time. Abebe, you have seven minutes. 7 minutes. We want you to be concise and give us your key points so that we can also allow our distinguished participants to be part of this conversation. You have the floor.
I think that this is better. Let me thank the ECA for inviting the African Economic Research Consortium to this very important event. I also recognize excellencies in the room and everybody who is here to participate and those listening online on the launch of the Economic Report for Africa. This is a series ECA is known for. It's a flagship publication. So I know how much effort, sweat, tears has gone into a particular report, whichever it is. So from that experience, I must thank and congratulate the team who has done this report. And we are here to learn from this report, the messages, to be inspired here. And hopefully also it will influence our thinking on the issues that have been covered. So Adrian took us through the main highlights of the report. So my reaction is a very quick one in terms of enriching the conversation around the topics covered in the report. One issue you read throughout the report is how we understand poverty as a social challenge. And it takes us through different features of poverty, how it manifests in Africa and everywhere else, of course, but most importantly in our region. There is a part of chronic poverty the report talks about, which means poverty where is so entrenched in the household, it becomes very difficult to exit without substantial external assistance, either through opportunities in jobs or other means of protection. And there is the transient part, which means all of us one day in our life might face a shock, which puts us to sleep, either to lose resources and become less richer, or we could also slip back into poverty. But what I found interesting in this report actually is, if you think of it in Africa, and also the report acknowledges the large population of the poor that we call is clustered around the poverty line, which sometimes varies from $1 to $1 per day per person. Now, the question actually that came to my mind was, poverty is hovering in the lives of this population. It's substantial population. We are talking about 45% of the continents. So it doesn't make a lot of sense if my income is improving in a day by 10 cents or 12 cents, because still qualitatively my life has not changed. So this is the aspect this report brings to our attention, which means this floating poverty hanging over the heads of people need to be removed through. This is where I think I would have loved the report to talk about more robust and inclusive growth. Without it, social protection for 40% of population is very difficult for any country to support. So I think this is a message we could even discuss. And I liked about the issues that attached to this vulnerability discussion. Of course, in when you look at growth in Africa, it has not been sufficiently robust. Even in the good times, the report acknowledged between 2000 to 2014, poverty has been relatively declining because of better growth. But you could see that that growth was not even stronger. The COVID-19 has shown how fragile growth has been in Africa. So let me quickly go into the macroeconomic impact, because that is probably where I know our discussant, Professor Barovigno, Anek, a world-class economist on income distribution and related issues, will talk about those. But maybe let me talk about the macroeconomic impact. The report mentions that the physical space has been severely compromised because of the pandemic in Africa. So I would like to, hopefully in the next series, because this issue is not going to go away easily. So if you look at the recent reports, about 22 African countries are in high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. This is a number compared to 2009, for instance, about 16. So it's accelerating, and many countries are already facing this challenge. So the question is, how do we think about development finance going forward in the post-COVID-19 situation? Considering how significantly the physical space has been degraded, is there a way to revisit debt management in a different context? The report talks about, for instance, thresholds for debt sustainability. I must acknowledge, of course, a report led by Dr. Morsi when she was at the African Development Bank. We did a nice report about really looking debt outside of the balance sheet of the government. You know, we should not be thinking about debt, whether it is going to be paid in future, but rather by using it today efficiently, effectively, how can we accelerate growth? So this is a different way of looking at debt management. So I hope in future, I think many African governments need to plan before even they decide to borrow. Why am I borrowing? Why do I put the money? Where do I put the money? Investment or just pay salaries? You know, those things need to be seriously considered in the discussion. So I think my time is getting up. So if you allow me 2 points on the social sector. The report mentions on health system, the financing. Let me tell you, we are in a really, really bad state when it comes to Africa's health system. I have a couple of points, but I think one of the main things is it has destroyed people's capacity even to exit poverty because of catastrophic out-of-pocket health expenditure. There is a lot of studies there which shows just because households do not have insurance. A very good example is actually Rwanda, which has now managed to do community-based health insurance coverage for 86% of its population. It's good to learn from that experience. The education one. Education in Africa is in a dire strait. Actually, it has reached a level of desperation. The statistics and the focus of our policymakers is to look good by reporting high enrollment rates, spending a lot of money on education, but the evidence is completely different. Our kids are not learning at all. So when you compare, for instance, Asian second grade and an African second grade is day and night. It's like we are counting years, but not counting what they are learning. So it's very, very important. This report also in future takes this issue. So finally, with your permission, Chair, the pandemic, at least in my view, we should see it also as an opportunity, not just a challenge. It must present opportunities that we should not miss. One example is improving the business climate. You see, we are talking always about development finance. It is out there. It's out there. The resources are out there, but our rules and regulations on property rights, on our court systems, on governance, etc., is so bad. Investors generally invest in extraction instead of in supporting the domestic economy. And finally, the political and economic governance, it covers everything else. Conflict is rising in our continent. There is a lot of coups which we have never seen before. So these are warning signs of weakening political and economic governance. And the chair is an expert in those areas. He has done a lot of work. Maybe he will talk about it. Thank you for your time.
Please, can we give him a round of applause, please? Thank you very much, Abebe Shemeles, for your intervention. We'll move on to the next discussant who is joining us online to make his intervention, Professor Francois Bourguignon of the Paris School of Economics. Francois, I hope you are there.
Yes, I'm here. I have a problem in the sense that should I speak in English or in French, or because I can see that the chair and the other people don't have any interpretation available, or is it?
I think English may be better.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. Okay, thank you very much first for inviting me to this panel. I'm really sorry not to have been able to travel to Dakar. I've not been there for quite some time, and this would have been a very nice opportunity to get back there, but it was not possible, unfortunately. I read with very much interest this report, and I think that, of course, it is extremely timely. And it is very timely to raise again the issue of poverty using the, okay, I have to start my video. Yeah, okay, here I am. So I think this report is extremely timely and is focusing in the field of poverty, which of course is a major field in development in Africa, is touching upon a very important dimension, which is this dimension of volatility. And the authors have done a very good job to looking not only at the macro part, as my predecessor just emphasized, but also at the micro part. And I could feel going through the pages of the report that very often there was some frustration about because of the lack of the adequate data to do the kind of analysis that would be optimal to understand and to elaborate policies that would be efficient or effective in reducing poverty and volatility. But let me focus on a few points. I would like to focus first on the issue of estimation of figures, because I believe this is important. And the second, I would like to focus on the concept of trap. And this is a point that the chairman has mentioned, and my predecessor too, I believe. And this is something which is absolutely crucial and that we should really keep in mind. But first, on estimation. I think it would be important when we mention the damage caused by COVID on poverty in Africa to make a distinction between what is really the impact of COVID and what is unfortunately, the dynamics, the normal dynamics of poverty. And from that point of view, we have to remember that if nothing else changed in the continent, if all incomes remain exactly the same, but if we look at population growth, then the number of poor people on the continent is increasing by between 12 and 15 million people every year. Which means that when we look at the evolution of poverty between, say, 2019 and 2020, the year of the COVID, and some months in 2021, then we have to make the distinction between what is due to the COVID and what is due to demographic growth. What I could see with the 55 million estimation is that this is slightly over what would have been expected based on population growth and based on the drop in GDP, or more exactly in GDP per capita. This is important because this suggests that the impact of COVID has not been uniform in the population. If there is more than what could be expected, given our knowledge of the impact of growth on poverty, this means that some part of the population have been more affected than others. And this is the case for poor people, but this is also the case for the median layer of the population. And this is where the volatility of the analysis in the report of that part of the distribution of living standards is coming in. But I believe this is important to be clear on figures in order to have a better diagnostic to what has been going on. My second remark on estimation on figures is that, and this is an old remark, I mean, something that I've done almost all my life, because I'm very much interested in measuring poverty and measuring inequality. The point is that with focusing more or less exclusively on the head count of poverty, the proportion of the population below $1.9 a day or whatever is the poverty line, is restrictive. Because in the COVID crisis, we have to look at what happened to the poor people who were already below 1.9. And most likely those people who were below 1.9 have been going further below 1.9. And they are becoming poorer. So we should not only look at the number of poor people, but we should try to get an estimation of the evolution of the severity of poverty. And this is a dimension which I felt was missing in the report, but for very good reason. The reason being that the data that would be needed to get into that, to see whether the severity of poverty has increased and by how much because of COVID, are simply missing. And I will finish on this with only one call, which is a policy call, which is let's make sure that we are trying to make efforts in order to follow statistically what is going on. I understand that because of COVID, it was very difficult to do the standard surveys that are being done in many countries in Africa now on a yearly basis, but we should make sure that the statistical capacity is there. Let me now move to my second point. My second point is about volatility, exactly. Insisting on the fact that volatility per se may not be such a problem if, of course, people have enough resources to smooth their consumption patterns. But, and this is certainly not always the case. And what is being said in the report is extremely important, of course. But what is more of a problem is the idea that there may be traps, in the sense that people who are falling below the poverty line and very much below it may be in a trap from which they will never get out. And this is something which is absolutely essential. And in this crisis, the real worry is the fact that because of the COVID crisis, many people would have fallen in this trap. And at the time, economic activity will come back, as it almost did at the end of 2021. And unfortunately, it's get to a stop because of the Ukraine war. To try to get out, I mean, to understand how many people are in this situation and what kind of policy is needed for those people who fell in the trap is something which is absolutely essential. And the trap, of course, is, I'm talking about the trap at the micro level, but there is also a trap at the macro level. And my predecessor very, very eloquently has mentioned the kind of trap that some African countries may be in, particularly because of the debt. But let me finish with an example, an illustration of the trap, which ties up with what has been said about education. One trap or one long-lasting consequence of the COVID will be the lockdown on the schools that took place in many countries. I worked recently on, or looked recently more carefully to the case of Uganda, which is a country where the lockdown has been the longest. 2 years, schools have closed down for 2 years. But if we try to imagine what is the consequences of that, of course, there may be some kind of remedial strategies. We can have the existing school offering remedial courses, although this will require more resources, in particular, teachers and professors. And we also know that in some countries, teachers and professors during the COVID crisis have left school because they didn't have anything to do. They didn't have any remuneration, so they went to do something else. So it's not even clear that a very dynamic remedial strategy will be possible because of this. But in any case, if we try to figure out what has been what will be the cost of this lockdown of schools, maybe let's say that 50% of the population will have missed, of the cohorts which are concerned by this lockdown, will have missed 2 years of schooling. If we look at the return to education in African countries, then 2 years of schooling may be responsible for a drop in future income during the lifetime of the people, which will be between 15 and 20%, depending on what years have been missed. So for these cohorts, which were caught in the lack of schools during the COVID crisis, we may be in a situation where those people will miss almost throughout their lifetime the 20% of their income. The cost is really big. Now, at the level of the country, it's not big in the sense that this is only a few cohorts. But of course, if things were to continue, and if the economy would not be able to recover very quickly, then this cost would be maybe bigger. So this is a very important dimension. So let me finish only with 2 remarks. One remark on one of the first points made in the presentation of the report, which is this reliance on market-led insurance mechanism to address the issue of volatility. Look, I mean, we know something in economics. It is that in the field of income insurance, there is no market-led solution. The solution must be a social solution. And my second remark to conclude, and this is a rejoinder with my predecessor, the Director of Research of the ERC, which is the fact that because there cannot be a market-led solution, because the number of poor people is so high in Africa, between 40 and 45%, then the solution, the social solution, can only be partial and addressing particular situations, as it was said, maybe the old people, maybe infants, or maybe special areas in the country. But there is not enough resources to have a program that will address all of poverty, as it was the case in advanced countries. And because of that, it is certainly the case that the solution to poverty and the solution to less volatility goes through economic growth and fast economic growth. And I wish and I hope that the situation that we are facing today in the world, but especially serious in Africa because of this conflict, will end up very quickly, and that it will be possible to come back to a growth path, which will be much more satisfactory than what we have seen over the last couple of years. Thank you very much.
Please, can we give Professor Francois Bourguignon another round of applause, please? Thank you very much, Professor Francois Bourguignon. I think the perspective of social dislocation in terms of schooling system and the whole idea of moonlighting, which came out of COVID-19, as part of the social aspects of that, I think is quite important, which you highlighted. Abebe Shemele's, underscored the point of inclusive growth. While inclusive growth is very important, because the whole idea of social protection and cash transfer cannot be a long-term sustainable project. And countries that are doing that, that have a lot of people, sizable number of their population in social protection systems, they are really under strain in terms of their resources. So it's better to crowd in everybody in the economy through inclusive growth for us to be able to address the issue of vulnerability and poverty. I think that's a very powerful point that you made. And I think this is an area that ECA is looking at very closely in terms of how do we promote inclusive growth by economies. We'll adjust the order of proceedings slightly. We'll open the floor for discussion so that we do not lose line of thought and conversation on this particular report. So we'll open the floor for 15 minutes for us to have conversation, questions, comments, observations on this report before we move to listening to the key messages from the 2022 report, which we're still finalizing and will be releasing in July. So the floor is open, comments, observations, questions that you may have on the presentation that we've listened to, and also the intervention by the discussant, the two discussants. So the floor is open, questions, comments, observations from participants. So Mahalet, can you assist with? Or do we have another mic? Okay, please, let's start with, please kindly identify yourself with your name and then your question or comment.
Hi, my name is Omar Benyela. I work for African Business Magazine. So you talked about the tight fiscal space and also the divergence ultimately, or the gap between what was spent in North America, Europe, and in Africa. Even though it was a big percentage of GDP, it's still small compared to what others managed to give in terms of fiscal stimulus. And when you're saying that the fiscal space is tight, and the ratios in terms of debt to GDP are at a precarious level in African countries, what solutions are you calling for to be able to kickstart economic growth and to provide further support? Are you saying that we should look at new options? I mean, you've been calling for SDRs to be allocated in a certain way. what are the solutions to provide African governments with that fiscal space or at least resources and ammunition to kickstart growth? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's someone next to you who wanted to take the floor. Someone next to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Siaka Temo. I'm the director of UNAIDS, accredited to the African Union and to ECA. I come from Addis Ababa. Thank you very much for all the interventions. Mine was just to remind ourselves that when we are talking about falling back in poverty, and as one of the panelists said very accurately, we are also having a learning and a health crisis. And this learning crisis is also related to the digital gap that we know, because other continents have not suffered the same way of the dropout of school and lockdown as Africa has. And this is affecting particularly adolescent girls and young women, because we know the intersection between dropping out of school, sexual violence, domestic violence as well as child pregnancies and unwanted child marriages and unwanted pregnancy. These are all the issues that are seriously affecting health security, increasing HIV and AIDS pandemic and other diseases. And we really need to look at how Africa is going to, in the recovery plan, to work on financing this part of recovery on health and education, strengthening and building health systems, preventing sexual and gender-based violence, and protecting our adolescent girls and women. Because we know that HIV, for instance, is affecting 6 out of 7 adolescents, 6 times more girls than adolescent boys. And this is really another looming crisis. We don't have the data right now, but we are running into a disaster. So our call as UNAIDS is to look at, first of all, increasing the domestic financing of health and to reach the universal health coverage target, to call also for addressing all the loss, the financing loss with tax evasion. This is another big issue, and to work on increasing domestic funding to the Global Fund. We are preparing a Global Fund replenishment in October, and it's really time for us to get our act together and to have our leaders accountable, because we cannot continue to rely on external resources. And we know that these external resources with the COVID and the crisis in Ukraine is not coming so soon. So we are really calling for more accountability and responsibility from our government to take in their hand the issue of financing the health system and to increase social protection as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can we come forward? Yeah. Sorry, then we'll move this side. But as we're moving, we also have to be gender sensitive. So we're going to call the female participants first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to all the panelists. My name is Shimanekela Otwe. I'm the Deputy Ambassador for Botswana Embassy in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Regarding the executive summary, on page 4, it is indicated that, and I quote, roughly 58 million non-poor Africans whose consumption is ranges between $1.90 to $2.09. That is 0 to 10% above the poverty line, are extremely vulnerable to falling into poverty because of the pandemic, unless supported by cash or food transfers. I want some clarity on this. And the reason why I'm requesting for clarity on this postulation is because experience in my country, the Republic of Botswana, has shown that generous handouts and loans are not effective as tools to economically empower citizens, but rather they create dependency among citizens. So in this regard, I really appreciate if you can help in advising as to what could be sustainable options to these handouts that I've referred to. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we bring the mic? The lady, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. My name is Dr. Nagla, Governor Advisor for African Affairs, Central Bank of Egypt. You have mentioned that there is a few countries that succeeded to pass a little bit with success through this crisis. This is related to the ex-ante reform. And thank God that that Egypt has succeeded in make positive GDP growth rate. And one of the main reasons you have mentioned that African countries facing the crisis increase the burden of the crisis is there is no fiscal space. This is related, in my opinion, about the situation between the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. There is a fiscal dominance in the African continent, and there is no independency for central banks to give him room to manipulate and face inflation that drain the income, especially for the poverty people. This is the main issue that African continent faces, which is that we really need the independence of central banks to fight. And it's also gave the central banks the room to manipulate and make initiatives to help and support the economy. Another thing you have mentioned, diversification. Yes, we have to diversify our trade partner and so on. But the main issue is transport and infrastructure for trade. I came here in 23.5 hours. So how can we make a trade between each other? This is the main issue. It is easy to trade with North rather than trade with my partner, my neighbor. So this is the main issue for Africa. This will help to succeed AFCFTA and will help to make MES, medium enterprise succeeded and encourage trade and increase the income for our continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take 2 more questions and so that we can respond. We have only about 10-15 minutes to end this session. Yes, you have the floor, then we'll come to you. Then we close.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Sylvester Mbango from Namibia. Thank you very much for the presentation. For the brevity of time, really I'll shorten my intervention. But in the first place, really I would like to concur with the analysis which has been done by 2 discussants, especially one on the economic growth or inclusive economic growth. And I think in our discussion earlier, I emphasized on that. I will not repeat much. My observation for the report is that we have diagnosed the problem, and we have also suggested some policy intervention. But my comment is that we should go beyond just policy recommendation, especially the first discussant, I think, said, I think we should look into the future. If I just look at page 6 of the summary report, the policy intervention which has been mentioned there, access to target social protection, improve access to labor market, promote employment for young people, provide social assistance to vulnerable, ensure health protection, build a health emergency, domestic vaccination production, create decent jobs. These are good to say, but how? That is my question which is left. How do we do this? And if we could answer how do we do that, then we'll be able to solve the problem. Chair, I don't want to take much time, but to justify what I'm saying, one of the policies which were taken and which the report has alluded to, it's we have made some monetary policy by reducing the interest rate. If I look to my country, Namibia, this has happened, that the interest rate really, they went to the lowest level, which we have never experienced before. But the impact of that, it was minimum, because one, there's too much informality. And when there's too much informality, despite the fact that you reduce interest rate, no one of these small businesses and so on who were prepared to go and take credit to invest in anything else. So the impact of that really is it's a minimum. Therefore, we should go beyond that. The other example, which is mentioned also in the report, is digital technology. Very good recommendation. Again, other countries, maybe, or my country, maybe other countries also, they are the same. There's a large part of our rural population, and then to invest in this digital technology, it's very expensive. And for private companies, there is no incentives for them to go there. So let me make it short. So I think my point is that really we should go beyond just recommendation for the policies, but how should we do this? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think if you go into the report itself, there is some details in the report, beyond the executive summary that you have. I'll call on the last participant to intervene. You have the floor, please. Please be very, very brief. We are really pressed for time. Be very, very brief.
Merci beaucoup. Vous me permettez de parler en français parce que je suis un vrai francophone.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in French because I am a French speaker. Firstly, thank you to the panelists. I'll try to be brief. Your presentations and remarks were very interesting. Firstly, growth and how this is taken into account in Africa. We've had good growth in recent years prior to COVID. Unfortunately, some of that growth is false growth. It's linked to extractive industries in essence, rather than to other sectors in our countries. So it doesn't have a lasting positive impact. So we have to make sure that growth is linked to our economic system, otherwise it will continue to be negative. As regards COVID-19, you said that this revealed two things about Africa. Firstly, the health system is very poor, as are our education systems. These are the two foundations of the development of any country. What can we do to improve these two sectors? In Mauritania, we've been looking at this issue. We've been looking at the informal sectors. And we saw how education and health had a significant impact on those sectors and particularly on women. Then the next question relates to financing growth, financing these sectors in order to drive growth. We need to have structural social investments in order to have free education and health. Obviously, you need finances for that. We have to make sure that poor people get access to these free services. Otherwise, we will not have a good health and education system in the future. We're not looking at our economic realities. We're taking things and experiences from elsewhere, and it's stopping us from taking an introspective look at ourselves. We talk a lot about the informal and formal sectors. This is really important for us because the informal sector is very significant. It's about 70% of the economy, but it's not being taken into account. We have to take account of this in our economic paradigms. So, you know, we're taking an interest in 20% of the population to the detriment of 70 or 80% of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll not have enough time to respond to all the questions. I'll call three people to respond very quickly. First, the Deputy Executive Secretary, Ms. Mosi, to respond. Then I'll call on my colleague, Edlam, who is the Director of the Gender Social Policy Division, to also say a few words to some of the questions raised. We'll get back to the floor very quickly for Abebe Shmiles to also say a few words. Then we'll bring this to a close.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick since we're running over time. I just wanted to come back to the issue that was raised regarding financing, which is very critical, and it's really the theme of our Conference of Ministers this year. Definitely the issue of creating the fiscal space at the current time is critical for policymakers in Africa to have the tools and the resources to actually address all the vulnerabilities and enhance the social safety nets that we're talking about. So we have been already advocating as ECA for a number of measures that really can help in that area. Among them, for example, was the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which really tries to give space for countries, the poorest countries, to actually have a breathing space to actually mitigate the macro and socioeconomic impact of the pandemic by really suspending the debt service payments for 2 years, and we're calling for this to be extended further. We've also been calling for SDR reallocation so that it can actually help financing countries. And, you know, this has, in part, some countries have already pledged, and we're seeing some of these reallocation going toward the Poverty Reduction Trust Fund at the IMF, as well as their new facility, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. So these are tools, but definitely more need to be done for the at the level of the global financial architecture to help countries tackle the new realities we have now, the new norm, the type of shocks that the continent has been faced with over the 2 to 3 years have been global shocks. It's no longer a country-specific shock. And that requires rethinking of the available toolkit. And that's what we're doing through a number of initiatives and through a high-level working group with the ministers of finance to look at these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Executive Secretary. I'll call on my colleague Edlam to briefly respond to some of the questions. She's the acting director of mic, please. Where's the roving mic?
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I will also be very brief, and I would want to focus on the intervention around the way forward. And what I want to highlight here to our distinguished member states, the participants here, is that indeed we're launching a report today, and we have policy recommendations in this report. But as ECA, we go through the entire chain of knowledge production, and thereafter the development of specific tools to apply the key findings and recommendations of these reports at the country level. So with respect to this particular report, in parallel to drafting the report and based on the recommendations, we have developed what we call a risk and vulnerability index, which assesses 11 dimensions of risk and vulnerability at the country level. We're already working with selected African countries on this. And so this is how we translate a report like this into actual application at the country level for our member states. So I wanted to highlight that. Similarly, on the question around health, of course, the report does highlight how health is highly interlinked to poverty and vulnerability, as has been expressed by some of the speakers. And even on that, we will soon be launching what we refer to as our health and economic growth report, which delves into the vulnerabilities associated with health in the COVID context. And we are proposing through that report a doing health index for Africa and for our member states. So just to really emphasize that as ECA, it is our priority to develop knowledge products, but then develop the tools that allow us to work directly with our member states at the country level. I think I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Edlam. Unfortunately, we are really pressed for time. There is another event, side event that's supposed to take place here, and the speakers are ready, and some of them are connecting virtually. So I would like to apologize to all of you, and especially to my colleagues who are supposed to make presentation on the key messages of the Economic Report on Africa 2022. We will find another platform to do that in the course of this meeting, so that that can be presented. So I would like to thank all of you for your active participation, especially to our panelists and guests, the Deputy Executive Secretary in charge of programs of ECA, Anan Mosi, our panelists for honoring our invitation to be here. Abebe came all the way from Nairobi to be part of this and arrived yesterday. Professor Boginon, we're really grateful to you for joining us from Paris to be part of this. Thank you very much. We'll continue this conversation, and I think on the corridor we'll respond to some of the questions and comments that you've made, which we could not respond to here. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your participation. So this is the end of the event, and we wish you a very good day. Thank you.